All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kidlit Distancing Social. I'm Laura Backus, and welcome if this is your first time with us. If it's not, if you're a experienced socialite, welcome back. We have a great panel of guests tonight. If you are new to us and you are interested in getting on our list to know about our future guests for the Distancing Social, as well as other stuff we do, you can go to writeforkids.org/ultimate-cheat sheet, get on our list, and also you will get a free ebook. We are celebrating our 30th year in business this year, and the Ultimate Children's Writing Cheat Sheet compiles our best advice for getting started writing for children, and that is a free gift to you. And if you are interested in subscribing to our newsletter, Children's Book Insider, which is sort of our flagship product, 30 years of publication, we have a special rate for our socialites, $5 a month, writeforkids.org/CBI. And the newsletter will be delivered to your inbox every month. It's about 20 pages, has marketing info, articles on writing, the business side of publishing, interviews. We also every month feature either an agent or an editor interview, and they give us a special above the slush code that you can use to submit your manuscript to them, and you get to jump over the slush pile as a CBI subscriber. And you have access to our CBI Clubhouse online membership site that has 30 years worth of articles, videos, webinars, all kinds of stuff. It's a great deal. So, as always, we celebrate your successes. And today I have a great celebration. Mary Rudzinski wrote that she had 2 articles accepted and published in Faces, People, Places, and Cultures Across the Globe, which is a great magazine, this past fall. Beautiful Birds, A Lesson in Diversity came out in the October issue, and An Island of Birds came out in the November-December issue. And it was her first time magazine publication. So way to hit it out of the park for the first time, Mary. That is awesome. Congratulations on that. I want to hear your good news. So email me at mail@writeforkids.org and put celebrate in the subject line and let me know what's going on with you. And it can be any accomplishment on your journey to becoming a published author, even if you finally found that critique partner you've been looking for, or you got a great idea that's exciting you and you're working on it. Anything, we want to help you celebrate. So send me your good news. I have one cool link of interest this week that I really wanted to alert you to, and this was on Jane Friedman's blog, which I reference a lot. So I have the link to her blog down there. But this article, Understanding Third Person Point of View, Omniscient, Limited, and Deep by Tiffany Yates Martin, was a really great article that really explained the different point of views you could use, points of view you can use in third person, and when is the best time to use each one. And it gave you examples of each so you could finally understand the difference between limited third person and deep third person point of view. So if that's something that still kind of baffles you, check this article out. And I made a bit.ly link, bit.ly third person POV. That'll take you straight to the article. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce my great panel. They have quite hefty bios, so bear with me here. I'm going to be talking for a minute. So, our lovely lineup this evening. Jennifer Swanson is an award-winning author of over 40 books for kids, mostly about STEM and history. Her books have been recognized with multiple NSTA Best STEM Book Awards, selected for the Junior Library Guild, have won a Florida Book Award and a Parent's Choice Gold Award. Jennifer has been a writing instructor and speaker and is a creator of the STEM Tuesday blog, STEM Team Books, and has a podcast called Solve It for Kids. And by the way, at the end of this webinar, I'm going to have another slide with links to all that great stuff, plus some other stuff we'll talk about tonight. And you will get the links under the recording when we send it out tomorrow. So don't worry. If we reference something, you'll get the link. Anyway, you can learn more about Jennifer at jenniferswansonbooks.com, and her newest book is Beastly Bionics from National Geographic Kids. And formerly an educator, Cynthia Levinson writes mostly nonfiction for and about mostly young readers, focusing on history and social justice. Her books have won awards and recognition from multiple national organizations, including the American Library Association, Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, National Council of Teachers of English, and the Junior Library Guild. Oh God, and let's keep going. That's just some of her recognitions. She conducts workshops and play shops. I love that, for writers and kids, and makes presentations to national and local audiences. So her most recent book is Fault Lines in the Constitution, the graphic novel. And she has a really great blog that goes with this that I will have a link to on that slide at the end. And next up, a picture book biography of the artist Ben Shahn, I hope I'm saying that right, called The People's Painter, which is coming out this year from Abrams. And finally, Melissa Stewart has written more than 180 science-themed nonfiction books for children, including, you all know who she is, Feathers, Not Just for Flying, Pipsqueak, Slowpokes, and Stinkers, Celebrating Animal Underdogs, Can an Aardvark Bark? And her newest, Summertime Sleepers, comes out from Charles Bridge in April. And she's also the editor of Nonfiction Writers Dig Deep, which has a lot of great essays from a lot of our great writing friends, including Jennifer and Cynthia. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you for having me, Laura.
Yeah. Melissa and Cynthia. Oh, there you go. Now you're unmuted. Yes. So let's get started. The reason we are here tonight, there was an article published in the Washington Post called Will My Grandkids Still Love Me If I Buy Them Nonfiction? And it was written by one of the education writers for the Post. Now, why did this hit a nerve with the three of you? Cynthia, you want to talk about that?
Sure. And I just want to back up for just 1 second and say, Laura, I've already started taking notes on CBI because of your introduction. If only I had known about CBI when I got started writing for children, I'm sure I would be much farther along and a much better writer now than I am. So I'm so glad you have so many people involved in the discussion and, in your subscriptions.
Well, thank you.
So, but exactly. Jay Matthews' article, Jay writes a regular education post for the Washington Post. And that one really did hurt. That was a good slip. Hit a nerve with the three of us and many other nonfiction writers too. For one thing, he likens nonfiction to textbooks. Ugh, he says, as if textbooks encompass the entire world of nonfiction. But even worse, his working presumption is that his grandchildren won't like nonfiction. The article came out shortly before the holidays, and he was worried about giving his grandchildren nonfiction when apparently at least one of them claims to prefer fiction. Another one can't quite tell the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Mm-hmm. He then goes on to explain accelerated reader and the Common Core standards and says, we nonfiction writers need to hang together. Well, I have to thank Jay because he has a wonderful sense of humor. We wrote the article that originally came out in Publishers Weekly and then was repeated in the Washington Post, and I got in touch with him. And he was very happy to be corrected. And we're just really happy also to correct everybody, people who have a more limited understanding of what nonfiction is and can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great that he was happy to be corrected. I give him a lot of credit for that.
You do too.
So you all created this wonderful response article that appeared in Publishers Weekly called Hey Grown-Ups, Kids Really Do Like Nonfiction. And then it was reprinted in the Washington Post to respond to Jay's article. And you cite a lot of great studies. As good nonfiction writers that you are, you brought research to the table. And these sources you cite say that children are significantly more likely to choose fact over fiction when allowed to choose their own books. So, did any of this surprise you when you were doing this research, Melissa? Did these statistics surprise you at all?
They didn't. It didn't surprise me. The statistics themselves did not surprise me. What surprised me is that these research articles go back to 2003. And so why hasn't this come to light before? That's the thing. I started to kind of stumble upon some of these articles back in 2017. I was so frustrated by the idea that most people in the children's literature community thought there were two kinds of nonfiction: narrative nonfiction and bad nonfiction. And that was so, it just made me so frustrated and so angry, because I knew that I was an info kid and I love expository nonfiction. And when I went into schools, I knew that I encountered lots of kids that were like me. And I was so frustrated in 2017 that I decided to take a sabbatical and do a research study myself. And because I had no idea how to do that, I don't even have that kind of educational background, I decided that I was going to look for articles that would help me hopefully come up with a model for the study that I wanted to do. And lo and behold, the research already existed, but no one had ever brought it all together. There was sort of this study over here and this study over here, and people had done that research and then they had moved on to studying some other thing. No educator had really dedicated their life to studying that. And so we really just needed someone to pull it all together and say, look, this is a thing. We need to pay attention to this.
Right. I imagine a lot of editors were thrilled that you pulled this together and made this case as well, because it shows that there is a market for nonfiction that maybe a lot of the buying public weren't aware of. And Jen, you do a lot of school visits. Yes. What do kids say to you about nonfiction, about whether they like it or not?
I mean, they really love it. I think that surprises some of them. Because honestly, a lot of school visits are done by fiction authors, big name fiction authors that they might know and whatever. And so when a school brings me in, I end up talking to the entire school. So I'll go K through 8. Mm-hmm. And, I even think some of the teachers are stunned, because I did a presentation with Astronaut Aquanaut, and my presentation is, which would you rather be, astronauts or aquanauts? And these teachers were like, okay, you're going to talk to 300 first graders for 40 minutes. Sure. They were kind of like, let me know when you want us to step in and, whatever. Yeah. And I kept them enthralled for 40 minutes. And then because I was showing them pictures and I was saying, imagine you're an astronaut. And when you present nonfiction that way, even though it's expository, it's fun and exciting. And afterwards, I would get emails from teachers and parents like a week or two later going, my kid said this. Like, do you know that we know more about space than we do the ocean? And they'd say all these facts. So yes, definitely. And I'm sure you guys, when you've gone, many of us have gone to school visits, teachers will say, this particular child never responds to a school visit, never raises his hand. And that will be the child that raises their hand and asks me and has a conversation with me. And the teachers are in the back going, like this kid doesn't talk. And I think it's because finally this child maybe heard something that they connected with. So I totally think this is a thing and they like it.
Absolutely. Well, my son, who is turning 25 in a couple of weeks, but when he was in elementary school, he was totally the nonfiction kid. When he had to do his AR reading and get the AR points. I think he read every nonfiction book in the school library that counted. And then he wanted to go back and read them again. And the teacher's like, no, 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 you have to have new books. So he had to start reading fiction. It was much harder for him to find fiction writer because he loved the realness of the nonfiction. And if a writer made stuff up, they had to really sell it to him for him to suspend disbelief, whereas a nonfiction was like, this is real. And he would create notebooks of facts.
Yep.
Like when he was 8, he decided he was going to write his own encyclopedia. And so he just started,
Awesome.
he got this notebook and he just started writing facts in it, just
This
random
sounds like
stuff.
my kind of kid, man. This sounds like my kind of kid.
I know. And so why do you think the adults don't see this in the kids who are in their lives and are expressing this interest? Why is it so hard for the grown-ups to see it? Cynthia, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is Jay put his finger on it, that adults may only have experience with textbooks as nonfiction, and those really can be dull. Steve Schenken, for instance, says that one of the reasons he writes exciting, and he writes mostly narrative nonfiction, one reason he does that is that he feels as if he's doing penance because he used to be a textbook writer. Right. So I think that's part of it. And I mentioned before, and we'll talk a little bit later on, I suspect, about the expansion of the richness of kinds of nonfiction, which grown-ups may not be aware of. Just, a few dozen, decades ago, I was a teacher. And I have a good friend. Please, nobody tell Joan that I'm taking her name in vain. My friend Joan was a 4th grade teacher, and she retired about 10 years ago. And she tries to keep saying to me, there's just no good nonfiction for kids. And I keep saying, Joan, there's wonderful stuff.
Don't say that.
And I feel especially bad, Laura, for your son, because we never hesitate for a child to reread a fictional book, yes, a novel, right, as if they're going to get deeper into it and understand the setting, the relationship, the characters, whatever. But too many people don't give kids the opportunity to let them get deeper into the nonfiction and then to jump off and explore on their own or organize it the way your son did. Nonfiction is so exciting, and I'm glad to have this chance for adults to become aware of it.
Well, and my son is also a very visual kid, and I love that there are nonfiction graphic novels now, as your newest book, Cynthia, because that really hits both the visual learners and the fact kids. And I think that just shows how exciting and creative nonfiction is now, with the formats and the way information is presented, which is just so wonderful. And you mentioned Steve Schenken. He was a guest a few weeks ago on our social, and he is one of my all-time favorite writers. He's amazing. Yes.
And I would just like to add one more thing too, because you mentioned visuals. Picture books, Jen mentioned biographies. There are many, many kinds, and Melissa will go into this, of nonfiction picture books. And I think adults are only recently beginning to realize that nonfiction and some fiction picture books too can be used across a wider range. We used to think of picture books as being, say, 4 or 5 to maybe 8-year-olds. Now they're 6 to 12, even 14-year-olds as an introduction, a jumping off point, and inspiration for further learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know they're used a lot in the classrooms. Even 3rd, 4th, 5th grade teachers are reading them out loud to the classrooms, which is wonderful. Yeah. So, Melissa, you developed this terrific classification system back in 2017 when you were doing this research called The 5 Kinds of Nonfiction. And I believe it was to help librarians sort of better balance out their nonfiction offerings. Is that correct?
I think that is something that has come out of it, but I actually created it for very selfish reasons. That I was trying to make sense of it myself. You can sort of think of someone like Carl Linnaeus, who wanted to organize the world of animals and plants and living things in order to try to better understand it. That was kind of the approach that I came to it. And as a scientist, as an analytical thinker, that made sense to me. And so I actually started this process in 2012, and my first attempts were pathetic. But over time and talking to a lot of really smart people, literacy educators, librarians, we all sort of were discussing it and talking about these ideas. And so it was at the end of 2017 that I posted on my blog this system that I had come up with. And to date, that blog post has gotten more than 500,000 hits.
Wow.
So it's really hit a nerve. And I'm writing a book with Marlene Correa, a well-known literacy educator, that's going to be out a little bit later this year, that talks about the 5 kinds. So they are traditional nonfiction, which is the kind of expository nonfiction that we grew up with, looking at very broad topics. It could be a book all about elephants or all about the Boston Tea Party. But then as nonfiction has evolved over sort of the last 25 years, there have been new categories that have been added. So first in the 1990s, we had DK introduce the eyewitness books, and those were the first browsable nonfiction books. There are also active nonfiction books, which are doing an activity or somehow getting kids really engaged in some way. There's also narrative nonfiction, which we've talked about a little bit. It tells a story or conveys an experience. And then expository literature, which has an expository writing style like some of the other forms, like traditional and browsable, but it's more literary. So it has, it could have any text structure you can think of. It can have an interesting format. It can have really rich language. So those are the 5 kinds.
Right. And if any of you are asking, we will have a link at the end to the 5 kinds of nonfiction, as well as when we send out the replay, so you can read all about it. I just happen to have this book, Melissa. So would this be browsable, because it is very high interest bits of information, or would you consider this expository? How would you classify ick?
I would call it browsable.
Browsable.
Yeah.
Delightfully disgusting animal dinners, dwellings, and defenses. So this is the kind of thing, if kids wanted extra fun facts about a topic, say they were, for example, they were writing a paper for school, and they just wanted to round it out with some interesting information, would this be the kind of book they would find? Or is this the kind of book, like if a kid is not, I don't know, they're just maybe not into reading long form nonfiction, but this will grab their attention? What would be the audience for this book and the purpose of this?
So I think, this is the kind of book that they might get at the Scholastic Book Fair or something like that, when their parents are giving them, a certain amount of money and they can choose whatever book they want. That it really grabs their attention. It's a high interest topic. It's got beautiful photographs. It's got a really compelling design. So this is the kind of book that a lot of kids would read for fun. It's entertainment to them. Not to say that you couldn't use it for research if you were doing a report, but I think it's the kind of thing that kids would just read. They might read in groups. You can skip around. And the same with Jen's Beastly Bionics book,
Sure.
Also published by National Geographic. There's a lot of different ways that you can access it.
Can I add something here?
Absolutely.
Okay, so another way that I see these books is a jumping off point. So you get the kids interested. It's almost, like, I mean, I don't know how many, I'm a huge Jeopardy fan. So I love facts. That's, that's me. I've loved facts my whole life. I was the kid who always read the encyclopedias. So books like this, I write because I want to grab the kids' attention and get them interested. And then from there, hopefully, they will go and look for more books on this subject, right? And they will maybe find interest in whatever. So I think, and this, to go back to, why did we get so annoyed about this thing, about Jay's article? It's because for me, that's what nonfiction is. It's an entry point to get kids interested and maybe grab them, in the STEM and STEAM
Mhm.
field or whatever.
Sure.
And you can do that with a biography, you can do that with expository, you can do that with anything.
Mhm.
But it's just that's why I write, I guess,
Yeah,
to inspire
sure.
kids.
Absolutely. Now, Cynthia, you write more narrative nonfiction, correct? Is your
Mostly I do, with the exception of the book that you held up, the graphic novel.
Mhm.
Yes, I do. I've written biographies and sort of histories of events about social justice, civil rights in different ways. And they tend to be somebody's story. I have a book coming out next year that I think of as a biography of a place.
Hmm.
But yeah, they do tend to be narrative. But the graphic novel, which I guess I should explain a sort of just a bit of background to it. It began as a book in prose. It
Mhm.
began as this book,
Right.
same title, Fault Lines in the Constitution, that my husband and I wrote together. And it deals with 20 what we call fault lines in the Constitution, 20 problems with the Constitution. Probably a lot of the folks here can name some, like, oh, for instance, the Electoral College. And we go into 19 others. But the reason I say it's not exactly nonfiction is that even though each fault lines chapter begins with a short story of maybe 3 pages, it also includes some expository background information
Mhm.
and some expository comparative information about constitutions around the world and also among different states. So it's possible in one book to have a mixture. But I think basically you're right, Laura. The ones I'm working on now really are storytelling
Mhm.
books.
And
Yeah.
I think the great thing about narrative nonfiction is kids who are fiction lovers,
Mhm.
Mm.
who might not be pick up nonfiction first, that has that fiction feel to it. It is a story, and it's often centered around a person, though you said you were telling the story of a place in your new book, but also there is a sort of a viewpoint, I think, that the authors bring to narrative nonfiction. You are choosing how to focus the story you're telling because you're not necessarily telling the person's entire life, you're telling a slice of it, and it's something that's got to be relevant to the audience you're writing for. So there's a lot of creativity uh, and a lot of similar skills as a fiction writer that fiction writers have that you bring to writing narrative nonfiction as well.
Yes, and I think that writing that way has actually improved my writing since my first book, for instance, which it's an important book. It's about civil rights in Birmingham, but I think thinking about applying fiction writing techniques, as you say, to nonfiction is improving my writing because I'm becoming more attuned to thinking about the various senses, for instance,
Mhm.
and thinking more about setting and people as characters and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. But for me, part of the joy of writing nonfiction stories is that people do amazing things that if they were written about in fiction would be really hard to believe.
Yes,
But
it's
when you
true.
read about a real 9-year-old girl who spent a week in jail because she was protesting segregation, that would be hard to take in a fictional book. But there, Audrey Faye Hendricks, there's her photograph on the back of the book
Right.
and the recipe.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's why kids like my son were love the realness of nonfiction because, what's better than that to have an actual hero, 9-year-old hero who existed, and we can read her story and see her picture. That's just amazing. Now, Melissa and Jen, you write more expository nonfiction, but you still bring a lot of personality to it. You are able to kind of pick a focus or a way into the topic that's either humorous, like with the ick, and it focuses on sort of the grossness of the topic, or whatever. So you have a lot of creative leeway, even with the expository books that you write.
Yeah, I think all nonfiction is creative in a certain way. And one of the things that nonfiction writers dig deep is all
Mhm.
about kind of what the idea at the heart of it is that each nonfiction author really brings themselves to it, their personality, their experiences in the world, their beliefs, that is in our books. People may not realize that. There may be personal connections that aren't obvious to anyone except the author, but they're still there. And when student writers infuse that same kind of, when they're invested, when they have skin in the game, the way that we do, it can enrich their writing as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, and if you write expository nonfiction, so if you look at my books, I'm heavily STEM, like on the technology, engineering, math side of things. So first of all, when you want to sell this, you have to have a big hook, because it's a little more difficult to sell a technology, engineering, and math book unless it's a biography, and I don't typically write biographies. So this is the book that I had last year, Save the Crash Test Dummies, which is the history of car safety engineering. Now, if I were just to tell you, I'm going to give you a book about history of car safety engineering, everyone would be like, okay, right? Like, sure. But if I title it, Save the Crash Test Dummies, and I have a crash test dummy that sort of talks, right? Like we don't have real live talking things in our nonfiction, but it follows the journey of how a crash test dummy saves our lives by making our cars safer. And
Mhm.
it has Newton's laws of motion, which is, a curriculum thing and all this kind of stuff. So I think, yes, this absolutely brings my energy and passion, and that's what you have to do if you're gonna write about topics like the ones I write about.
Mhm.
Because I don't have a really great character story. Um, I have a really cool technology topic.
Mhm.
So I have to make it larger than life and if you write this, you'll hear the word accessible. How many times have you guys heard your editor say, make sure it's accessible, right? Which is code word for everybody who needs to like it, even those that don't like STEM.
Mhm.
So if you can do that, then yeah, you can write about whatever you want.
Well, and what a great title, too. I mean, titles are very important in
Yes.
nonfiction because that's often what gets the kid to pick up the book in the first place.
It's also what sells it to your editor, which
Yes.
is more important for us writers,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's that hook. It needs that
Yeah.
strong hook, as Jen was saying, and that in the best books, that starts with the title. The hook is right built into the title.
And Melissa, I think of your book, No Monkeys, No Chocolate, as a great example of
Absolutely.
that. It's a
That
wonderful hook, great title.
Yep.
It does that really well.
Hmm.
You have a copy there? Are you reaching for?
I'm reaching for my copy. It's on the yeah.
Yes.
So this is an example, just as you were saying. I like to try to come up with titles that make people ask questions, and then they'll want to keep reading to find out the answers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And making those connections between monkeys and chocolate is so intriguing. And of course, kids want to have their chocolate, so they're going to find out what the monkeys have to do with this. So again, it's a great hook. Great hook.
I
So,
should clarify one thing, Laura, just very briefly, and that is um, Jen sort of referred to this, that we don't, make up dialogue, for instance, in our nonfiction books. I have to confess that the graphic novel version of the Fault Lines book is really a hybrid, because the facts that are all in it are true. I mean, that's a redundancy, facts are true. But there is made up dialogue, and there's a reason that graphic novels are called graphic
yes.
novels. It's
Right.
not novelistic, but there is created stuff in there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I just wanted to,
Yeah.
for those who are people who are understandably like me, really careful about fiction versus nonfiction, I do want to say, I know this is not really fully nonfiction.
Mhm. Well, and I think we're starting to see a lot more of that where there is this blending a bit. And as long as the facts are clear that these are the facts, I think it really harks back to the Magic School Bus books, back in the
Right.
early 90s, late 80s, those were published. They had a clear fictional thread and then a clear non-fictional thread in each book. And those were shelved in the libraries under nonfiction. I don't know if, I assume they still are, but I remember I used to have to go to the nonfiction section to get those, which I always thought was very interesting. I think they just didn't know what else to do with them. They were the first ones.
Yeah, I think it's important to say, rather than these books blend fiction and nonfiction, I know it's a matter of semantics, but I think really what they blend is fiction and facts, because nonfiction is a clear-cut line. It's either 100% true and it's nonfiction, or it could be informational fiction, which has facts. I mean, the main purpose of it is perhaps to convey information, but it does have some made up parts.
Mm-hmm. Informational fiction is a good term. I have heard editors using that term. So I like that. Someone just asked in the chat box, what do you call that? I think informational fiction.
And I think you need to be clear about that. For any of you that are writers, you need to be clear about that in your query letters when you're submitting, that this is not nonfiction. Because I do critiques on occasion, and some people have said, well, what if I say this, and well, my editor doesn't like this. Like, people will say, come to me and ask me to help them explain physics or something, and I'll send them back something, and they say, no, my editor doesn't like that because that's too hard to understand. And I said, well, that's correct. So are you going to make this informational fiction, or are you going to make this nonfiction? You have, and if you are the author, then you have to make that decision, and be able to talk to your editor and say that, fine, we'll find a different way to say this, but this is nonfiction. This is how you describe it.
Right. Right.
And sometimes informational can be a really great way to convey information, especially, if you want a book that, if there's some kids that are more fiction lovers and some kids that are more nonfiction lovers, these books can be a bridge, and they may appeal to a broader audience. But as Jen was saying, I completely agree. It's important for the author to be clear in their mind about what it is that they're creating and why they have made that decision.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we were chatting about this before our webinar started here. I was saying, between the three of you, you pretty much cover all the 5 types of nonfiction in your offerings. Is there a way to know as a writer what type you're best suited to write? Now, Jen, you talked a little bit about this, how this is just what you're drawn to. Is that sort of what you start with, is what appeals to you personally, and that's what, as a writer, what you should be writing? Or does the topic sometimes dictate how you write it?
Both.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm not really a biography person. That's just not where I'm drawn. There are plenty of people that write amazing biographies. Cynthia's one of them. And I let them do that. I am more interested in topics, and I kind of I look at his biographies as a great way to introduce kids to something, and then the books I write take it further. So you can read a biography about an astronaut, but if you want to know how astronauts train and know the difference between astronauts and aquanauts, then that's what you would read my book for. But the other thing we were talking about is sometimes, and this kind of goes back to the whole article about the textbook thing, sometimes as a nonfiction author, you're given a project. So you don't, you either do what's called IP work, where the publisher comes up with the idea and they come find you. I do that for some of the big 5, or you do work for hire. So I did this book, which is, can you see it? Everything You Need to Ace Chemistry. It's part of the Big Fat Notebook series with Workman Publishing. So this book is supposed to be sort of textbooky. So this would kind of be one of those things that Jay Matthews was like, oh, it's textbooky. But this is written in a very lively language. It's written kind of slightly snarky, like it is a high schooler who's really smart about chemistry and is kind of like, yeah, I know everything. This is what you need to know. It's like their notebook. But the funny thing is, whether or not this works, this book came out in September 1st. There are 825 reviews on Amazon for this already, which, if those of you that don't know, some of us are desperate to get 50, right? Like some of it, how many of us have like 12 reviews for our books? Yeah. So, and I think 85% of them are 5-star. So what I'm just saying is clearly people love this kind of book. So, and I bet any of Jay Matthews, not to keep picking on him, but any of his grandkids that were in chemistry might like this book, because I learned so much about, I mean, I had my bachelor's degree in chemistry, and if I would have had this book, I probably would have got, A's instead of B's.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, congrats on all those reviews. That's amazing. That is amazing.
I would say the same thing, both. Sort of like, what was the story about Pooh Bear when he gets stuck in Rabbit's hole and Rabbit asks if he wants, what is it, butter or honey on his bread, something like this. Is both, please. Yeah, for me, it's the same way. I do more tend to write narrative nonfiction, it's true, but the Constitution book is a hybrid. I have a book coming out next year that's in free verse. Part of it's in free verse and part of it is expository text. And I think of the way I write my books, the way I write books that actually get published and have some success, I think of as the book is whispered to me, how it wants to be written.
Yes.
I write a lot of books that I don't hear the whisperer, and those books don't get bought either by a publisher or, by readers. So when I find the right way for the way that a book wants to be told,
yes,
then I can kind of glide into it. And it depends on the topic and the tone, the voice, and the bang that it's going to give.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, but I think the topic, I agree with that 100%, Cynthia. I think the topic also helps to dictate it. For example, if you're going to write narrative nonfiction, it has to have a built-in story. And so a person's life is a story. Something about a historical time has a built-in story. And so it's very easy to write those as a narrative. Also, if you're writing about some kind of biological process, a narrative could work for that. Anything that can have a sequence text structure can work as a narrative. But if you're writing something that has a different kind of text structure, then expository is really the way to go. And many science concepts, as Jen was saying before, many science concepts lead themselves to an expository writing style.
Right, right. And then it's a matter of finding that great hook that kind of frames the expository presentation, like you both are so good at doing. All right. Well, I'm going to open up the chat box here because we have a lot of awesome questions. There's been several questions here on picture book biographies. Any tips for deviating from the cradle to grave approach when you're writing biographies for kids, Cynthia?
Yeah, what we've talked about in terms of what the hook is going to be, I think really helps a lot. I mean, I have biographies that are cradle to grave, even though it's a little bit harder to sell them right now, and also ones that are more discreet. And I think picking out the hook and then winnowing everything else out of it. Now, if there's an event, then that's easy. Then you've got, or relatively easy. None of this is easy, let me say. I find the shorter the books for me, the harder they are to write. Easier to edit, but harder to write. But if there's a discrete event, then you have a natural kind of structure or case there. One thing to think about, you can add an arc if it doesn't seem that maybe there isn't an arc in some brief time period, say. Think about beats. Think about building in either suspense or reinforcing the theme or a metaphor or a tone by prolonging a scene through beats. give that a consideration if you're trying to figure out how to turn something discrete into a picture book.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question about illustrations. Now, when fiction writers know they have, especially in picture books, they have no say over the illustrations unless they are also an illustrator. With nonfiction, first of all, I wanted to know if you have any input into the illustrations for your work, and if you have any opinions on whether photographs versus drawings are more effective. I know it depends on the type of nonfiction you're writing as well. So, Jen, what are your ideas? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so most of my books are what we call middle grade, so they're for third graders and up. So the majority of my books are done with photographs because the editors have determined for that age they like to have photographs. Now, in Save the Crash Test Dummies, if you look at this, of course, whoops, I can move around stuff around. Here we go. So this was illustrated and this is Crash. So throughout the book, there's some really fun illustrations. My illustrator was Tamika Grooms, who is actually a civil engineer, which is the coolest thing ever. So she has Crash doing different things throughout. So this is the first book where I had both, but like for Astronaut Aquanaut, this is the one that National Geographic did. I mean, it's National Geographic. They are going to use their photographs because they're amazing. Do I get to pick them? No, not when it's National Geographic. They pick most of the photographs. I did a World War II book called Spies, Lies, and Disguise, which is also a mix. Kevin O'Malley did some of the illustrations, and then I found some historical photos. So that I had something. So it just kind of depends. But I know Melissa can talk more about picture book illustrations because I know you get to do those.
Yeah, I have a lot to say because I've done all the research. I'm sort of considered the content expert as well as the author. And so I have many opportunities to look at the sketches and the final art and just to make sure that everything is scientifically accurate. And it can be hard, even if the illustrator has done a ton of research, and they usually do. There may be some scientific things that they get wrong. So we might have to go through a couple of rounds of sketches just to make sure that everything is in place, and, you know, to make sure that all the plants that are shown in a particular environment are actually grow in that environment, that they are blooming at the right period of the time, you know, right time of year. So all those kinds of details are my responsibility. And so it's important that I have several opportunities to just check and make sure that everything is working okay.
Yeah. Right. And Cynthia, do you get any input on your illustrations?
What I find is it depends upon the publisher. Some publishers kind of surprise me at the end of the process and say, oh, look, if there's a mistake, then, you know, I feel free to say so. Other publishers involve me, as Melissa is saying, more along the line just to prevent any mistakes from happening. But yeah, I mean, good illustrators do a lot of their own research as well. I was very impressed, for instance, with the picture book biography of Hillary Rodham Clinton a number of years ago. I don't remember who wrote it, but it was illustrated by Lei Wen Pham. And she was so specific in her research. She looked, for instance, even at group photographs where Hillary spoke, and everybody's clothing is accurate to the photograph. And she even in the end identifies every person, for instance, there. So, you know, some illustrators do a remarkable amount of research, which we all value.
Right, right, yeah. So I've had several questions here about submitting, etc. First of all, do you all have agents?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if that, obviously that does change a bit how you submit. When you are submitting a new project through your agent to an editor, how done is it? Do you write a proposal? And in the proposal, do you talk about how it fits into Common Core or STEM standards or anything like that?
So all of mine, since they're middle grade, I write proposals. We don't have to write the whole manuscript, which is kind of cool. On the one hand, on the other hand, the proposal can take 1.5 years to sell. So by the time it sells, you're like, oh geez, now I have to get back in this mindset.
Yeah.
So my proposals can be 15, 20, 25 pages long. It depends on how much of a writing sample. Sometimes it's 1 chapter, sometimes it's 3. If I've worked with the editor before, it's shorter. If I haven't, it's longer. Do I address Common Core? Yes, sometimes, but I don't literally say it's NGSS standard 5.3. I don't do that. I'll say it fits into the curriculum here. And that kind of goes in the little marketing blurb, but I don't spend a lot of time on it. I will mention it. And again, that's not the thing that's going to buy or sell it. It's the writing, it's the hook, it's whatever. If they want to know the curriculum, that's going to come after they buy it, when the marketing team is like, how do we sell this and to whom? So I wouldn't worry so much about putting that in your query letter or your proposal.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about you, Melissa? Okay, Cynthia.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would just agree with Jen that for middle grade, a proposal is good. Picture books, I have not been able to sell a picture book on proposal. In fact, my agent has said, don't even try. You need to have the whole text there, and it needs to be really as polished as I can get it. And then my agent comes back and makes me polish it more, in mostly including even the back matter as well. Sorry, Melissa.
I was going to ask about back matter, so I'm glad you brought that up. That's important in the initial submission then, as well.
Yes, for me it is. Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Melissa? How done is done?
I would agree with everything that Jen and Cynthia said. I don't really have anything else to add. I think I agree with them both.
Right. So if you are trying to sell a book, say like this, or like Jen's books for National Geographic that are expository, could you sell something like this on a proposal because it's a concept that carries through the whole book?
Well, it's not necessarily that it's a concept; it's that it's middle grade.
Right.
It's middle grade, so therefore I wrote, I believe, 3 sample sections, and then I had a pretty extensive proposal, and because the same elements are on each spread, by submitting 3 spreads, they had a very good idea of what the entire book was going to be. If I had been a less experienced author, I'm sure that I would have had to write more samples.
Sure.
But I had already done 13 books with National Geographic, and my editor, we knew each other pretty well. She was confident that I could write the entire manuscript, and so just the proposal was sufficient. But as Cynthia said, for a picture book, it doesn't matter how many books I've written for that editor. I have to write the entire thing every time, because it's just the concept isn't enough for a picture book. It's really how you write it.
Sure. Yeah. It's the execution is so important, right? And then as far as the back matter goes, do you put more stuff in than you think they're going to want, just so the editor can pick and choose? For example, someone asked, do you need a bibliography in your back matter? What are sort of your must-haves for back matter in general?
So I always have a selected bibliography, not the entire bibliography, because that would be like 700 pages long.
Yeah.
But I do have the selected biography, and there are certain things that award committees want, and if your book doesn't have them, you aren't going to win those awards. So you always need a biography, but you always need a list for further reading. So there are certain key things that they look for, but I always submit exactly the back matter that I think should be there. So I don't, and it's fully written out. So I don't throw out ideas, and I've actually never had an editor ask me for different back matter. suggest I add more, suggest I take something out. They always have been happy with what I suggest, and that's what ends up in the book. I think other people have different experiences, but that has been my experience.
Okay.
Because I write about historical topics often, a timeline is critical
Right.
for the back matter. And I find also, because especially picture books are so winnowed to follow a particular theme, the back matter gives an opportunity to get off of the theme and to give additional information in a more straightforward way. So
Right.
just, an author's note can do a lot of that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that a lot of mine, it's kind of funny because my topics are so unusual. Like, how do you, like, my super gear, nanotechnology and sports team up? It was kind of like the editor asked me to write an author's note about why did I write this book? Why was I intrigued? How did I bring these two topics together? So I'll include an author's note in addition to everything else that they were talking about. That can come later. I don't know that you need to submit that because that's kind of almost an editor's decision. Do they want the author note or not? But it's something that can be fun to add, to throw
And
out
actually,
there.
I would encourage the author's note for exactly the reason you give, Jen, to show the editor that you have some personal connection or interest that's compelled you to write this. It really gets back to Melissa's anthology of nonfiction writers. Why do we do these things? What draws us to spend the year and a half that it takes just to sell a book? And
Yes.
that's all before the writing, finishing the writing, and the editing starts. A lot of it is we have something that's compelling us to write this, and that can be persuasive for an editor.
Great. Okay, my last question for all of you, because we're at the top of the hour here. How important is it on your websites to reach out to teachers, to have things that teachers can use in their classrooms with your book, to make teachers' jobs easier? I know all of you are have great resources on your website for teachers and do classroom presentations. I assume that teachers are a big part of your market. That you're obviously you're writing for the kids, but you want to get the teachers too. So Melissa, let's start with you because you have a lot of wonderful resources on your website.
Yeah, I think for most nonfiction books, again, I hope that this will change, and I hope the article that we wrote will lead to this change of bookstores carrying more nonfiction, of parents and grandparents wanting to buy more nonfiction. But in the current marketplace, most of our books are sold primarily to school librarians. I would say they are our number one customers, public librarians, and teachers. And so I think the more materials you have that can help them to integrate the books into their lesson plans, the better off you're going to be. I think they really appreciate that.
Great. Jen, how about you? You have a lot of fun stuff on your site as well.
So I agree with that, but and I think we might talk about this later in another thing. I reach more of a STEM platform. So if you go to my website, it's not a typical author website. It's way more of a STEM platform because I'm trying to reach not just the teachers, but I'm trying to reach the parents. I'm trying to reach the parents of the kids who love STEM. And that's also one of the reasons why I started my podcast. It was a pandemic project like everybody else. But I try to get direct sales. So it's kind of interesting. My agent was like, some of your books aren't on Bookshop or whatever, but a lot of my books are on Amazon. And I know how we all feel about Amazon, but it's interesting because a lot of my book sales come from Amazon because a lot of my book sales are direct to parents, and that's where the parents are buying. Whether they shouldn't be buying there, they should be buying, but this is where they're selling. So I think it depends on what your platform is and who your audience is and trying to reach. I do have stuff for teachers. A lot of my stuff is also for homeschoolers. So I do a lot of homeschool marketing for STEM.
And that's a great market too. Yeah.
It's a huge market.
Yeah. And Jen's right. She's coming back on the social at the end of March to talk about platforms. So
Yeah.
stay tuned for that because she's the expert on that. Okay, and Cynthia, how about you? Do you do things for teachers?
I do. Every one of my books on my website has a link, resources for teachers, and it's not only discussion guides, but also a lot of extra sort of rich background material, a lot of primary source material connects for teachers, a lot of classroom activities, games, and links to other sites. So yeah, so for most of my books, I have both resources for teachers and resources for kids as a separate sort of block for, you know, a little bit older kids who want to learn more, do more, then they can just click on that and go.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to share one more quick slide here. I have here's some other links for you that we will also put with the replay under the replay for some of this stuff that we have been talking about. So this was awesome. Thank you, all three of you, for your time tonight and for this really great discussion on nonfiction and why it's awesome.
Yay for nonfiction!
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you for defending nonfiction and being here with us tonight. And thanks everybody who watched. And we will see you all next week. So good night, everybody.
Bye. Be safe.